Hello everyone. Today we'll be presenting on gender, globalization, and aesthetic surgery in South Korea by Ruth Holliday and Joanna Elfving-Hwang. The article was published in 2012 and examines why cosmetic surgery rates in South Korea are unusually high for both women and men, and challenges the common explanations that frame it purely as patriarchal oppression or Western influence. So, the article is written by two authors who come from a very different but complementary angles. Ruth Holliday is a professor of gender and culture at Leeds, and she has already published various works specifically on men's cosmetic surgery. So, her interest in challenging the idea that surgery is only a women's issue isn't new. It's central to her whole body of work. On the other hand, Joanna Elving Wong brings the Korean studies expertise. Her work on how femininity and national identity gets represented in Korean culture, which is exactly why this paper is able to go above and beyond just saying Koreans want to look Western. One thing worth mentioning is that the authors describe their methodology as scavenged, meaning no interviews, no field work. They're working from media sources, clinic websites, government statistics, and existing literature, which shapes what kind of claims they can confidently make and where the limits of their arguments are. Moving on to the main argument of the article, the authors start by looking at what previous academic research has said about why cosmetic surgery is so common in South Korea, and they find two dominant explanations for it. The first is the feminist framework, where cosmetic surgery is seen as patriarchal oppression, where women alter their bodies and meet male beauty standards. The view focuses almost entirely on women and tends to ignore or marginalize men's surgeries entirely. The second is the post colonial framework, where surgery is interpreted as westernization, an attempt to approximate a Western ideal, sometimes framed as a racial inferiority complex. This explanation overemphasizes Western cultural dominance and overlooks local Korean traditions and social forces. The authors are not arguing these perspectives are entirely wrong. They argue that it is incomplete, and crucially, both fail in the same way that they do not adequately account for men. A stat is that around 15% of Korean men were undergoing cosmetic surgeries as of 2010, and 44% of male college students were actively considering it. These figures challenge explanations built solely around women's oppression or racial mimicry. Instead, the authors argue that Korean cosmetic surgery is actually the result of overlap of multiple forces that include national identity, cultural traditions, global beauty ideals, social status, job competition, and gender expectations. These forces intersect, sometimes contradict each other, and cannot be reduced to a single explanation, hence, no single framework fully captures what is happening. The paper sits at the intersection of three big key terms: gender, globalization, and cosmetic surgery. Gender here isn't about just women. The author are deliberately challenging the assumption that surgery is a feminine practice. Globalization refers to how beauty ideals travel across borders, and the authors are specifically questioning whether what looks like Western influence is actually something more complicated and hybrid. Furthermore, some of the more Korean specific concepts the authors include are Sangho, which means natural, non made up beauty, is particularly important because it reveals the central tension that surgery is normalized, but natural beauty, is still considered superior. Furthermore, Gwansung Susul, which refers to physiognomic surgery, is where it shows that for many Koreans, the motivation for surgery isn't about looking Western at all, but it's about having the auspicious face that signals good fortune and character. Furthermore, Uljang equals to best face, the ideal young look Koreans pursue. People literally post before and after photos online for strangers to evaluate, which shows just how socially important facial appearance is in Korea. And then there are two terms for employment and marriage. Gwanon Sung Hyung shows that surgery here is practical and calculated. It's a deliberate investment in your future marriage prospects, not just about beauty. And then Chiub Sung-hyun shows that surgery in Korea is also deeply practical, where 80% of recruitment executives say appearance matters in hiring. Surgery stops being about vanity and becomes a rational economic decision applying to both men and women equally. Moving on to the attitudes towards cosmetic surgery, the section establishes how normalized cosmetic surgery had become in South Korea. About 20% of Koreans reported undergoing surgery in 2008, but the author made it clear that this was understated. About 30% of women aged 20 to 50 had some form of cosmetic treatment that same year, and 70% of Koreans had no objection to surgery at all. But what's more revealing about the stat is what the government behavior tells us. Surgery was made temporarily tax deductible, and about £642 million was invested in marketing Korea as a surgery tourism destination, and the industry was treated as a national economic asset. Even President Roh Moo-hyun had double eyelid surgery, claiming that it was for medical reasons. Despite all of the government involvement, the industry had no single malpractice until about 2007. So the state was simultaneously profiting from surgery while offering citizens almost no protection from it. Culturally, the normalization goes even deeper as clinics and shopping malls were treated like nail salons. Procedures were booked with friends as a shared social experience, and surgery was viewed as a worthwhile investment. Media, films, and TV dramas also consistently romanticize cosmetic surgery while almost completely minimizing risks and failed outcomes. The only real opposition came from feminist organizations, and even they were largely limiting themselves to challenging illegal clinic advertising. The authors note that even as surgery becomes normalized, a new distinction is emerging between natural and surgical beauty. The ideal is sango, non made up natural beauty, and successful surgery should look natural. But natural here specifically means enhancing Korean features, not approximating Western ones. Korean celebrities, on the other hand, deny having had surgery even as their features visibly change over time. And the societal expectation is that you continue to maintain that fiction. Only the wealthy can afford surgeons skilled enough to produce a truly natural look. So the natural Korean look becomes a class marker, signaling affluence precisely because it costs money to look like you haven't spent any. And the author points out that failed or cheap surgery gets described as looking unnaturally Western, marking both low class and a loss of Korean identity simultaneously. So, Westernization isn't actually the goal, it's what bad surgery looks like. And that single observation directly undermines the post.
Next, I'll be focusing on two sections of the article that critique how cosmetic surgery has been explained in academic scholarship. Rather than asking why Koreans undergo cosmetic surgery, the authors ask a more analytical question. Why do existing theories fail to explain Korean cosmetic surgery adequately? By reviewing Western feminist literature and Korean gender studies, they expose conceptual limits in how gender, race, and westernization are used as explanatory frameworks. The author's core argument is that cosmetic surgery in Korea cannot be fully explained as either a product of patriarchy or a desire to look Western. These explanations dominate both Western and Korean scholarship, but they oversimplify cosmetic surgery by treating gender as the primary mechanism and Western beauty as the universal ideal. Holliday and Elfving-Hwang argue that this approach obscures men's participation, misinterprets specific procedures, and ignores localized aesthetic logics. In the reading, the authors review feminist scholarship that frames cosmetic surgery as a women's issue embedded in misogynistic beauty cultures. Susan Bordeaux argues that women's choices are produced by the beauty industry itself, while Kathy Davis emphasizes women's agency, suggesting surgery is a meaningful personal choice. Despite their disagreement, both approaches share a crucial assumption that cosmetic surgery is something that primarily affects women. Men appear only as statistical minorities or divine cases, reinforcing the idea that surgery is incompatible with masculinity. Holliday and Elfving-Hwang closely analyze how even agency-focused accounts remain gendered. Davis, for example, links women's choices to pain, both the psychological pain of having the wrong body and the physical pain of surgery. While this framing counters the image of women as frivolous consumers, it subtly repositions them as victims. The authors point out that this mirrors public health discourses, where those who claim agency are seen as selfish, while those who claim victimhood are considered deserving. This structure reinforces a gendered moral economy of cosmetic surgery rather than challenging it. A key intervention in this section is the author's critique of how men are erased from cosmetic surgery research. Official statistics in the US and UK often exclude procedures such as hair transplants or cosmetic dentistry, artificially lowering men's visibility. When men are studied, their surgeries are framed as symptoms of a crisis of masculinity or metrosexual consumerism. Holliday and Elfving-Hwang challenge this by arguing that cosmetic surgery can provide body capital for men, improving employability, competitiveness, and relationships, showing that masculinity does not preclude surgical body modification. The authors then critique ethnic cosmetic surgery studies, which focus on non white populations in Western countries. These studies often frame procedures like double eyelid surgery as attempts to escape racism or approximate white beauty ideals. However, Holliday and Elfving-Hwang note that many respondents explicitly reject these interpretations, stating that they want to avoid looking tired or sleepy, not Western. The authors argue that this scholarship treats whiteness as a neutral, unmarked standard while constructing non white bodies as deficient, reproducing racial hierarchies rather than interrogating them. Furthermore, the authors review Korean scholarship that explains cosmetic surgery through Neo Confucian patriarchy and neoliberal capitalism. Scholars like Taeyeon Kim argue that women's bodies have moved from concealment to visibility, becoming objects for regulation and alteration. Park Sang-un extends this through the Korean foundation myth of the bare woman, arguing that modern femininity still demands suffering, now expressed through dieting and surgery. Park explicitly links this to Western globalization, stating that the contemporary bare woman is the Western female, an ideal most Korean women cannot attain. The authors do not deny that patriarchy and Western influence matter, but they argue these explanations are not enough on their own. If cosmetic surgery is framed only as women conforming to patriarchy, we cannot explain men's participation or Korea specific procedures that do not align neatly with Western beauty ideals. Likewise, describing surgery as simple westernization ignores Korea's nationalism and local aesthetic logics. Instead, the authors push us to move beyond rigid binaries like gender versus race or Western versus non Western. Cosmetic surgery must be understood as shaped by multiple forces at once: gender, globalization, capitalism, and local culture. Ultimately, their intervention is not just about cosmetic surgery in Korea, but about challenging the narrow frameworks we use to interpret bodies in a global world.
Building on that critique, where we've seen that patriarchy or westernization alone can't fully explain cosmetic Korean surgery, I'm going to shift us into the next move the authors make. They introduce what they call other colonizations, especially Japan, to show that Western in this context can operate as a historical and political positioning, not just an aesthetic preference. From there, they expand the explanation to include nationalism, physiognomy, competition, and changing gender ideals. Here, the authors basically say we can't explain everything with just Western influence. Korea was colonized by Japan from 1910 to 1945, and after liberation, a big part of identity was being seen as not Japanese. So when you see Koreans being compared to Europeans or Americans in some post war writing, it isn't always we want to be Western. Sometimes it's more about showing distance from Japan and saying we are different. That is why Western can have a political meaning here, not just a beauty meaning. This part is about how identity gets built. The authors argue that post war Korea leaned on tradition and elite culture to define authentic Koreanness. When identity is built that way, the body can become a place where that identity shows up, though how you look and how you're read by others. So they're pushing us to see beauty practices as social, not only personal insecurity or Western influence, but also the pressure to be seen as respectable and to belong. The authors argue that physiognomy isn't a minor belief, it has real social force. The basic idea is that the face can be read as evidence of character and future, so changing appearance can be understood as changing fate. That is why an inauspicious face isn't just cosmetic, it can be treated as something worth correcting. They use a memorable example: the story about President Chun Doo-hwan's mother damaging her teeth after being told it would change fate, not for the details but to show the logic. People may intervene on the body to affect life outcomes. Then they connect that older logic to modern social validation. It isn't only private self image, there is a right face culture where appearance is judged publicly through before and after images and comments, which turns beauty into a social credential. As a quick external example, a Korean makeover show like Let Me In frames transformation through dramatic before and after reveals and audience reactions. So it shows how improvement becomes something publicly confirmed, not just personally felt. The authors challenge a really common assumption about double eyelid surgery in South Korea: this idea that it automatically means Koreans want Western eyes. They argue that reading is too simple and doesn't match how the practice is actually understood. They explain that wider looking eyes can have local meanings that are not about becoming Western. In the paper, wide eyes are linked to looking more youthful, more alert, and more energetic. So, this feature can function as a symbol of vitality and social desirability in a Korean context. They also point out that similar eyelid procedures exist in Western cosmetic practices. That matters because it shows the technique itself isn't uniquely Westernizing. Procedures circulate globally, but the meanings attached to them can shift, like aiming to look more awake or refreshed depending on the culture. And to support the idea of a global circularization, we can see that Western trends like the fox eye or lifted eye makeup look becoming popular, using eyeliner techniques and sometimes tape to create a more lifted shape. I'm mentioning this because eye aesthetics don't move in a single direction, from west to east. Beauty ideals circulate, get remixed, and become desirable for different reasons in different places. Finally, the author emphasizes that many people aim for a result described as natural, an enhancement that still reads as recognizably Korean, not a full transformation into a different racial identity. That is why they're cautious about the westernization label. It can't erase what people say they're trying to achieve socially. Now the paper shifts into a more structural argument. The authors introduce two terms, marriage cosmetic surgery and employment cosmetic surgery, to frame surgery as a response to expectations built into major social systems, not just personal taste. The core idea is that appearance can function like a form of capital under competition. If people believe looks affect their chances of being hired or being seen as desirable partner, then investing in appearance, including surgery, can feel like a rational strategy for improving their position. In employment specifically, the authors describe how appearance can matter very early in hiring, including when photos are expected on applications and candidates are judged not only on qualifications but also on presentation. They also note that physiognomy can enter these decisions, especially when candidates look similar on paper, because appearance becomes treated as an extra signal about the person. This connects to the broader idea of appearance discrimination, often called lookism, where people can be advantaged or disadvantaged in social and economic outcomes based on how they look. I am using that term as an external anchor because it highlights the institutional pattern, not just the individual psychology. This is where the authors push back on a narrow explanation we often hear, especially in Western commentary, that cosmetic surgery is basically a woman's issue driven only by the patriarchy or men's pressure. They don't deny gendered pressure exists, but they argue it's incomplete if we ignore that men also participate. If men are changing in these practices, then we also have to look at how masculinity is changing. They discuss flower boy masculinity, kokminam, where grooming and a polished aesthetic can fit contemporary masculinity rather than contradict it. So cosmetic work becomes culturally ineligible for men, not automatically stigmatized as unmanly. Analytically, that shifts the question from why do women do this to how do gender norms make appearances work meaningful for different groups? And it supports the paper's bigger argument. You can't reduce cosmetic surgery in Korea to one cause, such as westernization or women only oppression, because multiple forces are shaping it at once. As a quick external anchor, Korean popular culture, especially K pop, has normalized visible male grooming and stylized aesthetic, which helps explain how a beauty conscious masculinity can feel socially legible or even aspirational. In this context, male participation in appearance work fits within recognizable masculinity rather than outside of it. So, overall, the section reinforces the paper's central claim. Cosmetic surgery is better understood as a negotiation among culture, competition, and changing gender ideals, not a single cause story. So, the main takeaway from this reading is don't reduce Korean cosmetic surgery to copying the West. The authors show it's shaped by Korea's history and identity, local meanings like physiognomy, and real competition in work and relationships, plus changing gender ideals. So, instead of asking, who are people trying to look like? A better question is, what is this practice doing socially? What does it help someone access, signal, or avoid? That is the shift the authors want us to make from a simple imitation story to a context based meaning story.
For the discussion questions, the first one is: to what extent can local cultural forces like physiognomy, national identity, and class explain Korean cosmetic surgery without defaulting to Westernization as a primary explanation? What does this debate reveal about how beauty practices in non Western contexts are interpreted more broadly? Second one, thinking about our beauty practices you see in your own social or cultural context, including non surgical ones like skincare, fitness, fashion, or filters, where do you see similar limits in how we explain people's body choices? What explanations do we rely on too easily, and what might they overlook? And the final one, in our reading, Holliday and Elfving-Hwang argue that appearance can operate like a social signal shaped by things like physiognomy slash right face culture and employment, cosmetic surgery, where looks can matter for first impressions and opportunities. Think about a time you felt your appearance mattered in a real way, like a job interview, a school setting, social media, or even meeting someone new. What signals did you feel you were being judged on? How does that experience help you understand why someone might see your appearance investment as a rational strategy in a competitive system? Where do you think the lines between personal
And thank you for listening.